It is great to be a Michigan Wolverine. Michigan football over the past 2 seasons has won 2 Big Ten championships. They've had 2 wins over Ohio State, 2 college football playoff appearances, with sadly no wins there. Hopefully that'll change this year. And also a total combined record of 25-3. 25-3, nearly a 500 winning percentage against top 10 teams, undefeated against top 10 teams in the regular season this past year. Michigan football is on a roll, and with the returning production they have, the staff continuity they have, the head coach they have, the strength and conditioning, recruiting, and transfer portal additions, all these ingredients combined into one sets up Michigan football for guaranteed success and improvement in 2023. Welcome back to the channel, guys. It's College Football with Sam. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Click the notification bell so you can get notified when new Big Ten football and college football content is released. Like this video, share it around, and watch it all the way through so I can get noticed by YouTube's algorithm, and comment your record prediction for Michigan football down below. We did a mini schedule preview a few days ago, and I'll also link that down below in case you guys want to check out my thoughts on Michigan football's schedule. But here we are. This is a video on why Michigan football can win the national championship, and why I think more specifically they will win a national title. Michigan went 13-1 last year. They finished number 3 in the polls, second in strength in simple ranking system. They were third in strength of record. They were fourth in ESPN's FPI and also fourth in ESPN's efficiency metrics. They were seventh in game control. They were third in average in-game win probability. These are all different metrics, whether it's by ESPN or sportsreference.com. And they were very high in points per play metrics and many other things. Michigan football was one of the best teams in the nation last year. And I will maintain the fact that they were better than TCU. They were better than Ohio State, despite their poorer finish than both of those teams in the college football playoff. But in the regular season, especially before that SEC and Big Ten championship game, where it was very clear that Georgia looked better in facing a better opponent, there was an argument for Michigan to be number 1 after they went into Columbus and whacked Ohio State, winning 45-23. They also had an impressive 41-17 win over Penn State, who finished in the top 10 and won the Rose Bowl. They rushed for over 400 yards in that game. There were points where Michigan looked absolutely unstoppable throughout the year. And this team is number 5, as I've already mentioned, in returning production. 84% of returning production is on offense. 78% is on defense. So 78 of last year's defensive returning production percentage returns, and 84% for the offense. The offense is 4th in the nation in returning production and 16th in the nation for returning production on defense. Florida State, Kansas, FAU, and Wyoming are the only teams that lead Michigan in returning production. All of these teams, by star talent, have inferior rosters compared to the Wolverines. Michigan, this season, might be favored to win the Big Ten. They are 5th, I believe, in most odds in winning the college football playoff. Ohio State is still ahead of them, and a lot of that just has to do with the simple truth that Ohio State's offense is built to more consistently compete at indoor college football playoff games than Michigan's offense is. Ohio State's offense is more modern. It's all around, in my opinion, a better offense. It's an offense that I think Michigan, despite the fact that Michigan has limited this offense and beaten it down 2 years in a row, there are things Michigan can learn, a lot of things from Ohio State's offense. like better wide receiver play, more vertical passing, just better QB play all around, and things that I would just, love to see at Michigan. But we'll see as Michigan recruiting will likely be picking up here. They're already top 5 for the 2024 recruiting class cycle, which began just a few weeks ago. So all what I just told you is just a lot of different things, facts, thoughts about Michigan football that are all really positive. The only negatives surrounding the program are what seem to be a series of scandals surrounding the university. Outside of that, I cannot think of very many negative things to say about this football program. This team returns one of the best rosters from last year, and with the amount that they return, they very well, never thought I would say this, in the Jim Harbaugh era, very well could have the best roster in the nation in 2023. Michigan is ranked in the top 10 unanimously entering 2023 by all the way too early top 25 lists. Bill Connelly is obviously the one who is in charge of ESPN's S&P Plus projections and their returning production metrics. Michigan is very high in both of those. Overall, they return 81% of their production. JJ McCarthy comes back. Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum come back. Luke Schoonmaker leaves at tight end along with Eric All, who was injured, but Colston Loveland emerged later in the year, got a lot of playing time, had several touchdown catches, and he's coming back. He was a true freshman last year. Zach Zinter and Trevor Keegan return. Michigan adds 3 offensive linemen via the transfer portal and 1 tight end in A.J. Barner. At wide receiver, Ronnie Bell departs, but Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson return for the Michigan Wolverines. So lots of returning experience. There aren't going to be very many green errors or green symptoms, if you know what I mean, from this football team. They're going to be more disciplined than last year's team. There's going to be better chemistry compared to last year's team. And last year's team was fantastic. So if Michigan was that good in 2022, and they were not the best team in the nation, Georgia was, and they weren't the most efficient team in the nation. I'd argue that even though metrics would disagree with this, I'd say TCU was more efficient. Ohio State, to a certain degree, was probably more efficient, just seeing how they competed with Georgia. And believe me, if they beat Georgia, they would have crushed TCU by 30 or 40 points. I mean, they outclassed TCU in every way. Every way. Ohio State had the better defense, better offense, even the better passing game and QB play, despite the fact that Max Duggan and Quentin Johnson at TCU led one of the nation's more explosive passing games. I'd also say teams like Tennessee might have been more efficient than Michigan. Alabama certainly had better talent than Michigan. I don't know if they were more efficient with the talent they had compared to Michigan, but certainly a more talented team, better roster. I'd just argue that Bill O'Brien and Pete Golding were not one of the top 10 coordinator duos in the country. So Michigan, despite being a near elite/elite team in 2022, still has a lot of work to do. They have a lot of room to grow. And I think that you're going to see that growth in 2023. They return 7 starters on offense. They return 8 starters on defense. They return 9 out of 12 defensive players who had 400 or more snaps. To be specific, they add 2 defensive transfers in Josiah Stewart and Ernest Hausmann. Some key guys and their statistics who returned for Michigan from the 2022 season: JJ McCarthy, who had nearly 3,000 passing yards, a 155 passer rating, 22 passing touchdowns, 5 interceptions, completed 64.6% of his passes, and averaged 8.4 yards per pass. He also had 306 rushing yards for 4.4 yards per rush and had 5 rushing touchdowns. At running back, Michigan, just to look at their rushing attack in general, they had 3,345 rushing yards last year, averaging 5.6 yards per carry, and they had 41. You heard me. 41 rushing touchdowns. Blake Corum returns after having a year where he crossed the 1,000-yard mark. He had 1,463 rushing yards, 18 rushing touchdowns. Donovan Edwards was 9 yards away from 1,000 yards. He had 991 rushing yards, and he had 7 rushing touchdowns. Corum averaged 5.9 yards per carry. Edwards averaged 7.1 yards per carry. They're both top 5 in returning production, top 5 in odds to win the national title, and they're top 5 in most, if not all, way too early preseason top 25s for the 2023 season. Michigan also returned Zach Zinter and Trevor Keegan, so both of their starting guards. Drake Nugent, who started at Stanford, will be plugged in at center, so Michigan's interior offensive line will service Michigan very well, and Michigan will run up the middle with success against nearly every team, if not every team, they face. And they return an underrated wide receiver core, in Cornelius Johnson and Roman Wilson. Cornelius Johnson having 6 receiving touchdowns, leading the team in that category. Roman Wilson having 4. Cornelius Johnson had 499 receiving yards. Roman Wilson had 376. Both averaged 15 yards per reception or more on the year. Also, Colson Loveland, 235 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, tight end for Michigan, who emerged late in the season. And he will get the main bulk of tight end snaps, as Luke Schoonmaker has declared for the NFL draft. So Michigan returns a lot of starters, a lot of 4-star talent out of high school, and I would argue 5-star talent after looking at how they've been developed in college. This roster is one that doesn't have the same talent in theory that Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia do, but I think that they can make up a lot of that with their staff, with their experience, with development, and especially with strength and conditioning. Also, Michigan, this isn't necessarily returning production, but their schedule, they start out with 4 home games. They start out with 4 of them, and they're all against cupcake opponents. East Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, and Rutgers to open up conference play. 4 cupcake games. Michigan can afford to have problems, and they can afford to learn in-game in the month of September. Any potential issues that Michigan has, unless we're talking about injuries that happen randomly throughout the year, can be solved and worked out in the month of September. When I say issues, I'm mainly talking about schematic issues, or maybe the whole team is just performing in a very underwhelming fashion. This team checks all the boxes. They can run the football, assuming JJ McCarthy makes a similar progression that he had from 2021 to 2022 and makes the same progression from 22 to 23. Michigan's passing game will have more of a vertical, short, medium, and downfield threat. JJ McCarthy will get more accuracy and better decision-making and more pocket awareness to pair with his already strong arm and scrambling capabilities. Michigan football will be able to run it with just as much, if not more, success, given that Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards will have another year in the weight room and in preseason practices. The offensive line with transfers should reload, similarly with the tight end room. And the wide receivers, who at times looked not all that good this past season, the majority of them return. And maybe we'll finally get to see Darius Clemens have some meaningful playing time in 2023, because what a monster he was out of high school. So that's Michigan when it comes to returning production, when it comes to their roster. Of course, the main question for them is, can they stack up against Penn State and Ohio State? Over the past 2 years, they're a combined 4-0 against those teams, but they travel to Beaver Stadium, where Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, and 80% of Penn State's offensive line remember the beatdown from last year and will be able to exact revenge on Michigan, potentially. Drew Aller also replaces Sean Clifford down there at State College, and Penn State's defense, I expect them to primarily reload, even though they lose a good chunk of their secondary and defensive line players. Questions for Penn State would, I'd say, include wide receiver. Michigan's secondary, who I think will be one of the best in the country, should shut down Penn State's passing game pretty well, in my opinion. But it's in Beaver Stadium, even though it's going to be a November game, which I'm, 99% sure that means it won't be an 8 p.m. start. I wouldn't be surprised if Penn State made that game their whiteout, as they should. And then even though the Ohio State game is a home game and Michigan is 2-0 against Ohio State, most of this roster will only know beating Ohio State. The Buckeyes, they return both of their starting guards as well. They return Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson, who the whole world has forgotten how good they are because of the injuries they sustained. Jim Knowles' defense will also be in year 2, which means Ohio State's defense in theory should grow at a faster rate than Michigan's defense will, because Ohio State's defense is really in year 2 of the scheme they have. Michigan's will be in year 3. And more often than not, you make the biggest jump from year 1 to year 2 compared to all the other years where you have a scheme installed. Michigan, look, I'd say they're more consistent than Ohio State on the defensive side of the ball, but Ohio State, they have a unicorn in JT Tuimoloau. And with new tackle play for Michigan, it projects that Carson Barnhart and Ladarius Henderson will be at left tackle, and right tackle, they'll be the 2 tackles. Miles Hinton and Trente Jones will also contend for those positions. That's a pretty deep tackle room right there. A guy like JT Tuimoloau can burn any tackle in the nation with his upside. And Ohio State also has guys like Mike Hall on the interior. They have Tommy Eichenberg at Steel Chambers at linebacker, and they have very much upgraded their secondary. So Michigan has a tough schedule, and even with their returning production, it's not that they're without question marks, but that's because the league they play in. That's because of the Big Ten East. So Ohio State and Penn State facing off against Michigan, those are 2 games that, as a Michigan fan, I'm very excited for. I'm very much up for the challenge. And can't forget, for Michigan, you can't forget road games at Nebraska, at Minnesota, and at Michigan State as well. So this roster, they're going to be loaded with experience and talent, but there is somewhat of a tough slate, as always, when it comes to playing in the Big Ten East. So with the tough slate, despite the returning production, and we know that Ohio State and Penn State, in theory, along with Michigan State, should get better compared to their 2022 counterparts, what are the reasons for optimism for Michigan? Well, one is staff continuity. Jim Harbaugh returns both of his lead coordinators in offensive coordinator Sharon Moore and defensive coordinator Jesse Minter. There were 2 staffers who left. George Hilo, him and Michigan mutually parted ways, and Chris Partridge replaced him at linebackers. And then there was Matt Weiss, who was fired for alleged computer crimes. That, I have no clue what that means. I'm going to assume it probably means something that is worse than what my imagination is giving me. But whatever. And he was replaced by an analyst who was off the field. Replaced by an analyst there, who's had quarterback work and has worked at Penn State and was Old Dominion's offensive coordinator. He will be the new quarterback's coach. But Sharon Moore, the offensive line coach, who coached 2 Joe Moore offensive line units in a row in 2021 and 2022, he's been promoted to the full-time offensive coordinator gig. And you have, again, staff continuity. Mike Hart, he's still coaching running backs. Steve Clinkscale still coaching the secondary. Mike Elston is still coaching the defensive line. Jay Harbaugh is still on staff as the special teams coordinator. So you still have coaches who have been here for the past 2 years, some in the case of Jay Harbaugh and Sharon Moore, longer than that, still on the staff, who have recruited most of these players, who've certainly had a huge hand in developing a lot of these players as well. Another thing to note in regards to returning production is Michigan was not that high exactly in returning production this past year. They lost a lot on defense. So returning production, again, is just a statistic. You can return a ton of players. Think about Alabama last year. Very high in returning production. It was one of the reasons I thought they were going to go 14-1 and lose to a 15-0 Ohio State. It was the same reason for Ohio State too. Both of those teams were top 25 in returning production. Alabama was even higher than that, I do believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they flunked. They're Alabama. They returned a ton of starters, a lot of production, and they flunked. And there are worse examples than them as well. It's just the best that can come off the top of my head. So returning production isn't everything, but it's one reason for optimism, and staff continuity, which is like returning production, but in terms of the staff, not the players, is another reason. Another reason, I've said that enough times already, their defensive backfield will be among the best in the country. Michigan's linebackers and defensive back rooms are elite and deep. Junior Colson, Ernest Hausmann, and Michael Barrett. That is a monster at linebacker right there. Speaking of not Colston Loveland, but Junior Colson and Michael Barrett had 3.5 sacks last year. Junior Colson was one of the best players at linebacker as well. He had 2 sacks, and Junior Colson also led the team in total tackles with 101. He also had 1 pass defended. Michael Barrett had 1 pass defended, 2 interceptions, one of which was a pick 6. He was second on the team in total tackles. And Ernest Hausmann was a standout at Nebraska. Fun fact about him is he came all the way from Africa, where he was born. He was born in Uganda in 2003, and his parents were poor, so they sent him off to be adopted, and they allowed an American couple to adopt him, where he was raised in Nebraska, attended Columbus High School, played on both offense and defense in high school. Really good kid, hard-fought player, and he last year had 54 total tackles, 1 sack, and 1 fumble recovery as a freshman in Nebraska. 6'2", 220 pounds. It's good to have him in Michigan's linebacker room, where he will either be starting or he will be a second stringer that gets significant rotational playing time. The secondary isn't exactly as deep, but Mike Sanderstill, Will Johnson are some of the 2 best players in the secondary. You could include Rod Moore along with them. Makari Page and German Green, guys that I'm not exactly as confident in, but Makari Page and German Green both have experience. They are a senior and a graduate student, respectively. Jaden McBurrows, RJ Moten, Quentin Johnson, Jalen Perry, and Zeke Berry are the backups for the secondary units. DJ Turner and Jamon Green were the players that departed from the secondary unit. I think with Steve Clinkscale's tutoring, this secondary will be among the best in the country. I would actually lean toward, along with the linebacker room, though Georgia's will certainly contend with Michigan at linebacker, for being the best in the country. Michigan also returns the best running back room in the nation. That is the thing that I'm most confident about when I talk about the best, and Michigan would be their running back room. And that makes sense because they had nearly 2 1,000-yard rushers. Both of their rushers averaged around 6 yards per carry or greater. And you watch Donovan Edwards, his receiving ability, his extremely high upside, and Blake Corum, who inherited Hassan Haskins' power football ability while keeping his own shiftiness and speed. That, combined with an elite O-line, watch out. And they also have returning production at the supporting cast positions when you're talking about the run game. Quarterback, JJ McCarthy has legs. Wide receiver, guys who are good at blocking. And the offensive line and tight end as well. Also, guys who are used for blocking. So there's plenty of reasons for optimism for Michigan football. And the schedule could be one thing too. Michigan could start slow and still have a really fantastic year because of their, let's be honest here, cupcake non-conference schedule. I do think Michigan will go 15-0, 9-0 in conference, and I think they will win it all. I think the questions surrounding Michigan's program are, what do they do after 2023? Or what do you make of Michigan's football program if they do underperform in 2023? And those two questions are sort of paired together because Michigan's recruiting classes haven't been all that fantastic over the past 2 years. And the 2023 class, to be honest, was somewhat of a disappointment. But that's all I have to say for this video. If you liked it, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, comment your thoughts down below. If you're listening on Spotify, please follow the channel, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.